electricity was turned on to the electric chair at 1:04. It turned off at 1:06. He was pronounced dead at 1:10. We have carried out this execution with as much humanity and dignity as possible.
The sentence of the state of South Carolina versus Donald Gaskins was carried out at 1:10 a.m.
On September 6, 1991, the South Carolina Department of Corrections executed Donald Henry Pee Wee Gaskins for the murder of death row inmate Rudolph Tyner.
Fry him like a chicken! People of his kind are ripe for the picking! Shave his head and apply the gel! Pull the lever and send him to hell!
The jeering applause from spectators as his body was driven away seemed to end the saga that would forever leave its mark on the state.
There you go, right
there. But death didn't silence Gaskins. Shortly after his execution, an autobiography of the self-confessed murderer was published that would raise the level of horror beyond anyone's imagination. In Final Truth, Gaskins divulges his life story to writer Wilton Earl, accounting for all his murders, which he claims to be over 110. His taunting biography quickly gained popularity, indelibly tainting the region and leaving behind more questions than answers.
Hello, I'm Patty Just. We're taping this program just outside the walls of CCI in Columbia to talk with our guest, author Wilton Earl. Mr. Earl has written a number of works, including his latest one entitled Final Truth, the autobiography of mass murderer, serial killer Donald Pee Wee Gaskins.
I wrote to Gaskins. I received all the permissions to have 2 interviews with him to discuss this idea. And when I met him, I told him I was not interested in writing a book about him. I wanted to write his perception of his life. And we recorded all of our conversations. It was truly his story, his perception, with nothing in there from me except probably, as it turned out, a 1-page preface and 6 pages of notes at the end. The rest of the words are Gaskins.
Any of my uncles or aunts didn't like, they would take a hedge bush switch or a pear tree sprout or an apple tree sprout, as long as it was a good switch, and they'd tear my back and legs up. There'd be red stripes all over my body and legs. And if my sister told them I had done anything, no matter if I had or I had not, they'd beat hell out of me. And that's the kind of treatment I was got as a childhood. This is Donald Pee Wee Gaskins saying so long for now.
With the publication of Final Truth, Pee Wee Gaskins lived again in word and in voice. The paperback version included this cassette recording, which added texture to the book's horrifying details.
We'd had many requests for feature stories on Pee Wee Gaskins. So I asked one of our authors to write up something on Pee Wee Gaskins. And it turns out the only information that he was able to get at that time was from a book called The Final Truth. I started reading the information in the story and was horrified at some of the things that Pee Wee Gaskins allegedly did. They were just so cruel and inhuman and psychotic, or what seemed just a monster. And I thought to myself, can this person really have been so evil? And Pee Wee, in that autobiography, had posed himself as a serial killer. Serial killers are frequently psychopaths that aggrandize themselves all the time and lie continuously. I don't think Wilton Earl realized that it wasn't the truth. How would he know? Here he is taping a person that had a very bad reputation in South Carolina as a killer. And so there was every reason for Wilton Earl to believe that this was true. There is the speculation by some of the family members that Pee Wee was being given some money under the table. I don't know if this is true. Pee Wee did say to one of the family members that they wanted a juicy book, and I'm going to give them a really juicy book.
The autobiography is full of contradictions that start at the beginning with discrepancies that are simply a matter of public record. Gaskins was born with the name Junior Parrott on March 31st, 1933, in the small farming community of Prospect in Florence County, South Carolina. Like most of the residents there, his family owned their own land, but also worked on a more prosperous farm to make ends meet.
His mother, Yulie, had him when I believe she was 26. He was one of ultimately 5 children. She lived with her parents, Lewis and Fanny Parrott, who were farmers. He grew up in this farm family, decent people, went to church, they're good people, worked very, very long hours. All of them, the women, the men, worked very long hours, and they were a close-knit family. Then there was Pee Wee, who believed that his father was a very prosperous, well-known, and esteemed farmer and owner of a store named Henry Gaskins, who was married and had children. Don't know if that's true. Certainly Pee Wee believed that, and it's possible that Henry Gaskins believed it. He was basically spoiled. He was so adorable and so precocious and so manipulative that they just loved him. So he may never have been spanked. Someone said that maybe Yulie spanked him once. So talks about abuse and stuff are baloney. He was undisciplined, and that was part of the problem, is that he should have been disciplined, and he wasn't. And he got out of control because he didn't have any boundaries set for him. Now, some things started to appear by the time he went to kindergarten, elementary school, and I spoke to one of the women that taught in his school. And by the time he went to kindergarten or first grade, the abuse of animals was quite obvious. He would pull the leg off of a bullfrog and then, see how it could jump. He would take a bird's nest and kill all the eggs. He would trap birds and murder them, snap their heads off. Now, this is an alarm bell, okay? There was something wrong right from the beginning.
As Gaskins grew up, so did his predisposition to violence and crime. He was the leader of a small group of boyish thugs who committed a number of break-ins and petty thefts in the community, and even raped one of its members' younger sister, a crime for which they were all brutally whipped. In 1947, at the age of 14, he attacked a neighbor girl with a hatchet, allegedly for resisting his sexual advances. After bludgeoning her, he left the girl for dead in a ditch by the side of the road. Some passers-by discovered her and rushed her to the hospital. That episode landed Gaskins in the Boys Reformatory in Florence County. In Final Truth, Gaskins claims he was repeatedly gang-raped by the other boys and tried to murder one of his attackers by stabbing him multiple times. After placing Gaskins in solitary confinement, state psychologists determined there wasn't anything wrong with the violent youth, other than just being plain mean. He escaped from the reformatory several times and got a job as a carnival hand before being apprehended and returned to the reform school. Finally, at age 17, after one such escape, Gaskins married the daughter of a carny, which kept him from being admitted back into the reformatory, having spent most of his adolescence incarcerated. Gaskins was now legally an adult. Rumors of his life of crime began circulating. Farmers wanting to collect insurance money by burning down their tobacco barns often enlisted his services, but his propensity for sexual violence overshadowed all other activities. In 1952, Gaskins was sentenced to 6 years in the state prison for assault and attempted rape. During his incarceration, Gaskins claims that he was raped by one of the bosses among the inmate hierarchy. He took revenge by stabbing the inmate to death in front of prisoners and guards alike. The murder garnered him an additional 8 years in prison, but more importantly to Gaskins, it gave him the respect and power within the penal system he needed to stay alive and be in control. Pee-wee was paroled in 1961 only to be arrested shortly after for the rape of a 13-year-old girl. During his arraignment, Gaskins escaped from custody by jumping out of a second-story window of the Florence County Courthouse, injuring his leg in the process. After stealing a car from the parking lot, he eluded police for days before he was apprehended. This time, Pee-wee only served 7 years before being paroled. After his release, he seemed to have reformed, taking a job with a roofing company in Sumter, doing odd jobs around the community, and staying on the right side of the law. In 1970, Gaskins' niece Janice Kirby and her girlfriend Patricia Alsbrook were reported missing. When asked if he knew of their whereabouts, Gaskins told his family that the two had been talking about running away. His family believed him. In 1971, law enforcement once again came knocking on Gaskins' door. He was picked up as one of some 1,500 suspects in a high-profile kidnapping and murder case of state legislator James Cutno's daughter, Peg Cutno. The small community of Sumter, and especially local law enforcement, were determined to solve the crime involving the daughter of someone so prominent. Gaskins was questioned and released. Pee-wee's employer was able to account for his whereabouts, even though the girl was seen the day of her disappearance walking past where Gaskins was repairing a roof in downtown Sumter. After being asked if Gaskins was indeed a suspect in the case, a law enforcement official told reporters that, well, Pee-wee's just a punk. He pretends to be a criminal in order to attract women. But it wasn't the last time law enforcement would answer questions about Pee-wee's involvement in the Cutno case. Gaskins stayed out of the way of any investigations for several years. However, that's not to say he halted his criminal enterprises. Pee-wee had graduated into grand larceny, creating a small car theft ring where associates would steal cars out of North Charleston and bring them to his property in Florence County. Although suspicious of Gaskins, authorities never actually closed in on any of his activities. By now, the 70s were in full swing. Throughout the nation, as well as the South, a carefree attitude dominated everyone's outlook on life. Pee-wee had been married several times by now, had fathered 2 children. He floated between residences in Sumter, Florence, and North Charleston. He worked for a well drilling company and drove around a hearse, a plastic skeleton hanging from the rear view mirror and a bumper sticker that read, "We haul anything, living or dead." Rumors of his dark side surfaced from time to time, but few took him seriously. Even when it seemed that numerous folks were missing from the area and Gaskins would brag about having a graveyard, officials failed to make any connection. That is until 1975, when a teacher from North Charleston reported one of her students missing. Kim Gaskins was 13 and still in the 5th grade. She had only been in Miss Griffin's class at Chicora Elementary School a few days when her sister told her teacher that Kim had failed to return from a trip to the country with a neighbor couple. After calling police and filing a missing persons report, North Charleston police detectives armed with a search warrant went to a trailer in Williamsburg County, where Gaskins and his wife Donna had lived. They found items of clothing belonging to the missing girl, but there was no sign of her or the trailer's occupants. Their investigation led to a man by the name of Walter Neely, one of Gaskins' associates in the car theft ring.
Well, they came, and of course they had to involve the sheriff's office because they were looking in Florence County, along with sled agents, people from Williamsburg County, North Charleston, a lot of people involved. Walter, I really don't know why, but he just decided to come clean. I don't know if he and Pee Wee had a falling out or if he thought he was going to catch the pressure from all of it or what, but he just finally broke down and started talking about a mass grave site in Florence County.
Pee Wee had gotten wind of Neely talking to the police and was attempting to leave the area. Police tracked him down and surrounded his house on Manning Avenue in the town of Sumter.
They were staked out around the address all 4 directions. Whichever way he turned, there was somebody to follow him. And as soon as he left in the cab, he was let get away just a short distance from the dwelling and was stopped and arrested. And he in fact did surrender to my dad, sheriff at the time, Albert Parnell. In his possession in the cab was a cardboard box containing a .30-30 rifle that the stock had been removed from but was in the box. So it would be much shorter and much easier to conceal. And also was a .32 caliber Beretta semi-automatic pistol on which Pee Wee had taken an electric pencil and written his own name in his own handwriting, like a signature, on both sides of the gun, as I recall.
About everybody in the lower part of the county was scared to death of him because he drove a hearse, and he used to always tell people that, you know, he would haul people off in his hearse. Most of the people, nobody really worried about him because they drifted around from town to town, and nobody had any reason to be concerned about him. Knowing Pee Wee, I knew he was capable of a lot of things, but you know, I would have never pictured him just killing a bunch of people for apparently no reason.
Walter Neely eventually led authorities to the edge of the field in Prospect, where he claimed a number of people were buried. Investigators from North Charleston, from Florence County, Williamsburg County, and the State Law Enforcement Division began scouring the area.
What was unusual was vegetation had been cut off at an angle with a knife. So we all started pulling on bushes. And when we found a spot where more than one would come up, then we started with the probes or started carefully examining that area. We found 6 bodies that day, that way. 2 per grave.
Well, at that point, once we discovered the first bodies, it was dark at the time, right about dark time, so we weren't able to do anything then other than put some deputies out to guard the site. This is the area on the other side of this field, all the way back on that tree line in the back corner of this field, is where what we referred to as the mass grave site, because there were we recovered 6 bodies out of this area.
One of the deputies told me that there was going to be a big case that was going to break. I didn't have a name at the time, but I was going through some arrest warrants, and I saw his name on an arrest warrant, and I just tucked it away in the back of my mind to see if this was going to be a name that surfaced with this big case that was going to break. And it was going to involve bodies that were buried in shallow graves. And I remember thinking as the story unfolded, and I was probably about 25 or 26 years old, and I thought to myself, this is the biggest story that I'll ever cover in my life. And I thought, gee, you know, my career has peaked and I'm only 25 years old. And that was pretty much true.
I didn't know where it was. I was working out at the Florence television station. They said, Prospect, you need to go down there. they're digging up bodies. I said, what? So, you know, I took off down there. I was a one-man crew at that time and went down there by myself, and I got there and Sheriff Billy Barnes said, we have some graves. We don't know how many people at this time.
We brought the pathologist up from Charleston the next day and SLED forensics team, the Sheriff's Office forensics team, and we started digging up the graves and processing the graves and the bodies on the scene.
We had Dr. Sexton and Dr. Brissy from the Medical University were on site with us to help with the exhumations. And it took several hours to get those first two exhumed. And then we went, located two more a short distance away to the left and two more a short distance away to the right front. In each case, two to the grave, all within the space of probably 30 yards. The investigators would go back and look at the missing person reports and see if we could find out, you know, who's missing, who are we looking for.
By the end of the day, the team had identified the remains of Dennis Bellamy and Johnny Knight. The two half-brothers had been stealing cars for Gaskins and were last seen with him. They had been reported missing for a little over a month and a half. In another grave, two more people, Diane Neely and Avery Howard, were found buried together. The ex-wife of Walter Neely and her new boyfriend had been missing since April of 1975.
Walter Neely was a person who was retarded but violent, and he was somebody who willingly engaged in Pee-wee's criminal enterprises at a very low level, and he was someone he could control, completely control.
They met in prison. They had interest in the same thing. They worked as roofers together, but Pee-wee was the main guy, and Walter Neely was ready, willing, and able to assist him once Pee-wee decided upon a course of action.
In a third grave was another estranged wife of a close associate of Gaskins and her boyfriend. Jessie Ruth Judy and Johnny Sellers had been missing since June of 1974.
I had written a story saying that Pee-wee Gaskins was going to be charged. And the editors were really worried that I'd made a mistake, but I hadn't. And then after, there were some other people arrested first, and then Pee-wee was arrested, and then Pee-wee just became the centerpiece of this investigation.
We know that the last two that went missing that were associated with him were the first two that we exhumed. Dennis Bellamy and John Henry Knight. I took the SLED airplane and flew to Charleston to attend the autopsies of these two young men. Dr. Sexton did the autopsies. As he did his autopsy, you know, of course they take the top of the head off to examine the brain. They were shot in the head. As he recovered the bullets from the brain material, he put them in my hand. I rinsed them off, put them in a container, sealed them, and came straight back here to SLED. I examined the bullets and determined that they were .32 auto caliber. I test fired the gun that had the signature and name of Donald H. Gaskins written on it, and was immediately able to make an identification on both bullets from the head of both victims, as I recall. Allegedly, the reason that he shot the two young half-brothers was that they were involved in a car theft ring with him, and he was getting a little scared that they were going to fold and inform on him. So he eliminated them as witnesses. They were buried right near a large oak tree that he was allegedly looking at to put a chain hoist in to pull engines out of cars. He asked him, "What do you think about that limb? You think it'll hold an engine?" And when they looked, he shot him right in the back of the head, dropped him right there. And he did them not together, but separately. He dug the hole one time, buried one, come back, kill another, and put two in one hole.
Once we found the victims and were able to identify the victims, then things started snowballing. We found more victims, and as the victims were found, they all tied back to a common reference point, and that was Pee Wee Gaskins.
I'd been with a television station about 4 years, and I'd covered a lot of stories, but this was the biggest story. You know, network news. I mean, this was amazing to me as a young reporter, and it was probably the most exciting story that I'd ever covered up until that time. The people that actually knew Pee Wee were telling me that, you know, well, he's not a bad guy. I said, he's not a bad guy. They connected him with these bodies they're digging up now down there. Well, he's always been nice to me. But then later on, as the story continues, I go back to this place after they dug up 4 or 5 graves, and then the ladies start telling me, oh yeah, he used to come in here all the time and tell us about all the people he's killed. You know, I think the story got a little bit bigger. The people added a little more to it that lived in that community, because they could say, I know Pee Wee, and this is the story I'm telling.
Well, there's no question that in my career in law enforcement, Pee Wee is the biggest thing I've ever experienced. It was the biggest thing in the state of South Carolina. And it all happened over 30 years ago, and we even had the national networks. We had CBS and ABC, I believe, send live trucks down, and then they were doing live shots on the 6 o'clock news from down in the swamp at Prospect. And, you know, in a small place like Florence County, that's almost unheard of. But so it was a major happening, and still is a major happening for this area. I don't think we've had anything else like it here or in the state.
But despite the shock and horror of the mass gravesite, those discoveries were only the beginning of a long and drawn-out series of searches and recoveries. Walter Neely led authorities to another location, not far from the original crime scene in Prospect, called Alligator Landing, a low-lying area that would frequently flood. The discovery elevated the degree of Gaskins' crimes.
This is the area where Doreen Dempsey was found buried in a sawdust pile. She was in the pile, covered up with a sheet of plastic and sawdust on top of her. Her small child, Robin Dempsey, was buried in a tree stump hole in the same area.
Doreen had been a friend of one of Pee Wee's wives, and had lived with them for a while, and had relationships with various African American men, which Pee Wee did not approve of. And so Robin was a mixed-race child, and this angered Pee Wee quite a bit. And then she was carrying another mixed-race child, which made him even angrier.
Gaskins had murdered the mother and child a few steps from the back door of his house at the intersection known as Prospect Crossroads. He drowned them in his pond, then drove their bodies to Alligator Landing.
Everybody in the Prospect community knew him, knew his family, knew all the people who were missing and who later, it turned out, were murder victims. And there was a lot of, I would say, fear in the community, but then I think people were relieved to know that Pee Wee was in custody and that he would probably never get out of jail for the rest of his life.
The murders had become a sensational national news story, and people began to ask about other missing persons in the area. Where were Pee Wee's niece, Janice Kirby, and her friend, Patricia Alsbrook? Where was Kim Gelkins from North Charleston? And there were others missing from the area, all last seen with Pee Wee. In May of 1976, Donald Gaskins went on trial for the murder of Dennis Bellamy. The trial lasted less than 5 days.
Well, it was as much public interest as you could find. 8 people found buried and more suspected killed but not found, all at the hands of this little short guy, Pee Wee. The evidence we were able to present in court started with Pee Wee himself and his family. There was substantiated rumor that Pee Wee had bragged about his graveyard in his part of the woods. He had no witnesses other than himself that I recall. He had to combat the fact that we had his own family connecting him with the boys, his history of having the graveyard, the ballistics, tools for digging graves found in his possession. So he took the stand in this very courtroom, and in a very cool and collected manner had a response, a seemingly logical answer to everything that implicated him. And yet during the testimony, one of the most telling memories of the trial was when there was a pause. He reached in his pocket and pulled out what appeared to be notes, as if during his time awaiting trial in jail, he had come up with what would be the most plausible explanation other than his guilt. This particular murder, that charge of murder, carried the punishment of the death penalty. If you were tried for murder and found guilty of murder, then you got the death penalty.
In the trial, Gaskins blamed Walter Neely entirely for the killings. Neely implicated himself only in the Knight and Bellamy case and received a life sentence. His defense claimed Neely was mentally retarded and acted under the control of Pee-wee. After Gaskins was sentenced, James Judy entered into a plea agreement with prosecutors as accessory in the deaths of Jesse Ruth Judy and Johnny Sellers and received a shorter sentence of 10 years.
As it went on over time, he, began to really brag about it then. You have to know Pee-wee to understand that. Pee-wee was just one of those fellows that he wanted to be probably the biggest and the baddest that's ever been in South Carolina. And once he got started talking, you couldn't hardly shut him up then.
We kept getting information about some cement slabs from Pee-wee through his attorney. And so we went there, and it was actually the cover over the septic tank. It was just several big cement slabs. And we took a large wrecking bar, lifted that slab out the way, and there was a skeleton laying in the bottom of the septic tank.
The remains were those of Patricia Aldsbrook, who had disappeared along with Pee-wee's niece, Janice Kirby, 6 years prior. But he had not told police he knew anything about her whereabouts yet.
There were obviously other homicides that needed to be dealt with. While those were pending, the United States Supreme Court changed the law as it applied to the death penalty to require states not to impose it automatically. Furman versus Georgia dictated that you had to have individual consideration for anybody first found guilty of murder. So that conviction got returned for resentencing. There was an interest in providing closure to the families of the victims of the other homicides. And for that reason, he was allowed to enter a plea to those other homicides and receive a sentence of life imprisonment.
The plea bargain arrangement between the solicitor and the attorneys for Donald Pee-wee Gaskins is an incorrect resolution of this particular case. I'm totally dissatisfied and dismayed with this kind of arrangement where a mass murderer who has pled guilty to atrocious and vicious crimes is now escaping the death penalty. The efficacy of the death penalty law and statute in this case is simply negated by this particular arrangement and handling of this case by the solicitor. Frankly, it sets a dangerous precedent, because how can anyone who is charged with an individual murder be given the death penalty when a mass murderer such as Donald Pee-wee Gaskins has used a legal arrangement such as plea bargaining to escape the death penalty?
By now, the entire nation was focused on this little town in South Carolina, where some suspected a serial killer had been operating undetected for years, and the estimated death toll began to climb.
After the 8th body was found in the Prospect area last year, further searching was hampered by bad weather, and eventually the search for bodies was called off. TV 13 at that time indicated in its coverage of the story that some law enforcement officials felt more bodies would be found. However, we were unsuccessful in our attempts to get an official statement to that effect. Today, a story in the state newspaper quotes a reliable sources saying as many as 31 additional bodies are still undiscovered. Solicitor Kenneth Summerford told TV 13 today there have been a number of rumors about additional bodies and that those rumors would be checked out. One can only speculate as to whether additional bodies will be found, but it appears the recent conviction of 3 men may not be the last chapter in the state's worst mass murder case. Cecil Chandler reporting for TV 13 News.
Several times I got a chance when they were trying him to go down into the room where Sled had him. You know, he seemed like a nice guy. But deep back in your mind, you're thinking, this guy, I just heard him, admit to these people that he killed when he was in court. And it's hard to judge a person by looking at him. And Pee Wee was hard to judge.
Authorities began combing through the unsolved missing person cases in the area, and eventually their investigation led to a parcel of land near the trailer where he and his wife had once lived across the Florence County line.
We're in a remote area in Williamsburg County, right out of a place that's known as Roper's Crossroad. On this side of the road is where we found the body of 14-year-old Kim Gaskins, who had run away from Charleston with Pee Wee. At the time, she was living in a trailer about a half mile from here with Pee Wee, and Pee Wee told his family one night that he was going to take her to the bus station and put her on the bus back to Charleston, but instead he brought her to this deserted road, killed her and buried her right there.
In locating the body of Kim Gaskins, the little girl whose disappearance ultimately led to the discovery of the carnage in Prospect, authorities had unearthed the body of a Turbeville man as well.
And over in the field on this side of the road is where Barnwell Yates's body was found. Barnwell was lured out of his trailer, picked up by Pee Wee and a couple other people, put in the trunk of a car, brought out to this field where he was killed and buried.
Silas Barnwell Yates was a prosperous farmer who had been missing since the year before. Police would quickly learn that this murder had been for hire.
Pee Wee wasn't going to tell us anything until we had some goods on him. And he didn't want to give up anything without something in return. It was like a bargaining chip.
Police began focusing on the final days of Yates and who his associates were. They learned that in 1973, Yates left his family and began to sell off various pieces of farm equipment and land to purchase gifts for his new girlfriend, a Lake City woman named Suzanne Kipper. When the relationship went sour, Yates demanded the gifts be returned. Kipper and her new boyfriend, John Philip Owens, enlisted the help of a man named John Powell, who knew Pee Wee Gaskins. Police arrested all four. Pee Wee claimed he had not committed the murder, but suddenly, in the middle of his testimony, he started admitting to other murders. Gaskins claimed he had been hired to murder several people, including a sheriff's deputy and an African-American prostitute in Sumter. He confessed to murdering 2 men in Conway, and he confessed to the murder of Peg Cutno. The confessions caused an uproar. A man by the name of Junior Pierce had been serving a life sentence in a Georgia prison for the murder of Peg Cutno, and John McDowell, who had been serving in the same penitentiary as Gaskins, had confessed to the Conway murders. In exchange for a life sentence, Gaskins pled guilty to the Yates murder and agreed to lead authorities to more victims, if there really were any more.
Got information that there was another victim, and as we were actually walking and looking, we had some people cutting bushes out the way to see if we could see anything, because it was a grown-up ditch bank. And I remember standing there beside my dad, and just watching this work and waiting until we could start sifting or digging, and looked down just over to the right, and it appeared to be an odd-shaped rock. And I went over there and brushed some leaves back, and it was the skull.
Pee Wee Gaskins told authorities they would find a body in the creek near this pine tree. Sled and Sumter County Sheriff's investigators began looking in the creek this morning, but they didn't find a body in the creek. On the bank, though, 100 feet away, they found skeletal remains. Convicted murderer Donald Pee Wee Gaskins said a body authorities would find here was the victim of his assassination. Gaskins said it was a black woman, 20 years old, called Clyde. Gaskins said he killed her with a poisoned soft drink. Gaskins also said he murdered Margaret Peg Cutno, the 13-year-old daughter of a Sumter legislator. Sumter Sheriff Bert Parnell says that is not true.
He's not right about Peg Cutno. No way in the world he could have killed her. Different MO altogether.
You were saying earlier that he just tells you what he wants you to know.
Right. tell her what she wants to know and wouldn't tell you anything else. Anything that would be favorable to him.
Martha, to make some money or maybe to get some things from Pee Wee, agreed to be part of this threesome with one of his wives and with Pee Wee. And the belief was that she became pregnant, and because Pee Wee was a total racist, complete racist, went and started to tell people about that. Again, she posed a strategic threat to his reputation, and that sealed her doom.
This is the spot where we found the body of Janice Kirby, who was Pee Wee's niece. She was actually killed in Sumter County, but she was brought over here and buried in this spot right here.
And the Kirbys were very, very religious people. They were decent, honest, hardworking people. And they had a number of young children, and Janice was one of them, a beautiful 13-year-old girl. It was initially treated as a runaway case. There were these problems, you know, internally with the family and Pee Wee and so forth.
By 1978, it appeared police had all the bodies accounted for in Prospect and Sumter County. Pee Wee was not charged with all 13 murders, but he received multiple life sentences, assuring citizens that the world had seen the last of Gaskins on the outside. Regardless of the fact that he managed to elude the death penalty after being sentenced, residents in South Florence and throughout the state felt the pint-sized murderer would never kill again. But in 1982, the unimaginable took place.
Well, we got a call from the Department of Corrections that an inmate named Tyner, who was on death row, had tried to blow his way out of death row.
Rudolph Tyner was a death row inmate who had been convicted of robbing and killing the owners of a Merle's Inlet bar.
They removed a speaker from his head, a speaker like you take out of a radio, about that big. It had gone in the side of his head and embedded almost on the other side, and he was missing almost all the fingers on one hand. The hand was literally blown off, which would indicate he was holding whatever it was up to his head, not calculated to blow anybody's way out of anything, but to kill him. And of course, around the corner, the building man for that cell block, the building man would be the head trustee, was a guy named Donald Pee Wee Gaskins.
I need one electric cap and as much of a stick of damn dynamite as you can get. I'll take a damn radio and rig it into a bomb before he plugs it up. That son of a bitch will go off and there won't be no damn coming back on that.
So that gave us a pretty good indication that Pee Wee was involved. And then they found this guy Martin, who was from the beach, who was friends with Tony Simo. And Simo was the son of the people that Rudolph Tyner had murdered. And Simo had gone through Martin and arranged to hire Gaskins for $100 to hit Tyner in the prison.
It's nice to believe that your client is innocent, but that is not the criteria for giving effective representation. Many times, guilt or innocence is really just not a concern. It's a question of making sure the system works. So even for people like Pee Wee Gaskins. Because if it works for Pee Wee Gaskins, it works for everyone.
I mean, you know, if not Pee Wee, who? I mean, if you're going to have a death penalty, if Pee Wee Gaskins doesn't get put to death, who should?
Almost a decade after the original bodies were discovered, the state managed to do what the Supreme Court had overturned in previous sentencing. Donald Henry Gaskins was sentenced to die in the electric chair.
He knew this was it. He told me over the phone, he says, this is it, this is it. They're going to get me this time or something like that.
Every several months or every year or so, he would send word that he would take us to another body. And then we'd have to go down to CCI, the old prison, do a search, check him out, take him to wherever it was. We carried him back to the Prospect area. And there were about 10 of us that were in the detail. He kept wanting to go in a certain direction. He said, just turn me loose. I'll go through these briars and I'll show y'all where the body is. Well, we didn't fall for that. And we spread ourselves out about 100 yards long so that we kept a good eye behind, a good eye in front, and a good eye to each side. We saw the same little small pickup truck in 2 different locations. Went by, turned, waited a while, came back by, turned, which seemed a little odd, but they never made any overt acts toward us. Later found out that they were in fact going to try to take him from us. But there was at least 10 of us, like I said, and we were not bunched up, we were spread out. And that was at least one attempt that was planned to try and break him loose from us.
Pee Wee somehow got my private number into the sheriff's office while he was in the penitentiary. And he would call me periodically. And if he had something he wanted me to look at, he would tell me, I got something I need you to look at. But he kept always trying to tell us about 60-something people he had killed. He would walk with a very, very distinct limp, like he couldn't hardly walk. But if you weren't watching him, he could run like a rabbit, and that's what he was trying to do when he, get us to take him out in the woods to show us another allegedly body, a spot where somebody was buried. He was just looking for a chance to get away. Because we never found any more bodies after we got the original bodies. He would always say, well, it's been so long and things have changed so much, but it was just an excuse to get out of the penitentiary and hope that he could get a chance to break away from us.
As time ticked away on death row, Gaskins was unable to produce any more bodies or evidence to make another deal to prevent his date with the electric chair. Although Gaskins' prison liberties were severely reduced, he still managed to keep up a rapport with the news media and stay in contact with family and friends. Enter writer Wilton Earl. Earl convinced Gaskins to allow him to document his life story. For over 15 months, Earl managed to record 120 hours of Gaskins' spoken words, promising not to alter them and not to publish them until after his execution. It seemed Gaskins was fulfilling a dream by immortalizing himself in an autobiography, but there was more to the story.
I tell you, Gaskins has just sort of faded from my memory, to be frank with you. I was involved in prosecuting a number of very high-profile cases fairly quickly. I got a call on my cell phone from Robert Stewart, the head of SWAD, and said, do you know where your daughter is? Well, my 4-year-old daughter should have been in preschool at Trentham Road Methodist Church. And I said, well, she's in preschool. He said, are you sure?
Well, I received information from an informant that Donald Jr. and another individual were planning on kidnapping some of Solicitor Harpootlian's family, and they were going to exchange this family member for Pee Wee's release. And if they did not release Pee Wee and they put him in the electric chair, they were planning on killing this family member.
You know, back in those days, if the solicitor picked up the phone and said, I need this inmate brought up, no one's going to question it. And if I had him brought into my office, no one would question that, because the solicitor, is not going to do anything to help the inmate. Now, Gaskins, I had a back door nobody knew about, except Gaskins did. And he wanted to be brought into my office. He'd go out the back door.
A lot of people felt like this was another effort on his part to try at the very last to try and get some better deal. Unfortunately, he did it at the expense of Dick Harpootlian and his child.
Even though it looked like that plot was foiled, was who else had Gaskins talked to? He had access to a phone. I mean, he could have, talked to 15 people and asked them to do the same thing. And it would not have been unlike him to have a backup plan.
As the date drew near, the entire nation watched as news agencies tallied Gaskins' crimes.
Pee Wee Gaskins says he killed 14 people in his life. Court testimony and his confessions show that it started
the first week of September, Gaskins was transferred to the Capital Punishment Facility at a new corrections complex on Broad River Road in Columbia. Even then, Pee Wee did not relinquish any control. Shortly after being transferred to the death house, Gaskins tried to take his own life by slashing his wrists.
Zimmerman says 2 officers were watching the cell all night. She says they didn't see anything unusual. Investigators do not know what Gaskins used, but the wounds were said to be clean as opposed to jagged cuts. Officers last week did find razor blades hidden in an address book in Gaskins' cell on death row.
There is no doubt that he is fighting this to the end, that he does not want to go to the chair.
On September 6, 1991, crowds gathered as the state of South Carolina prepared to do what had been thwarted back in 1976.
A rowdy crowd of about 400 people in favor of the death penalty came to the Broad River Correctional Institution to cheer Pee Wee Gaskins' death. But some had personal reasons to come, like family members of some of Gaskins' murder victims.
Dennis Bellamy, Johnny Knights, and Diane Neely were our sister and brothers.
And they got killed a long time ago.
So,
they didn't have the death penalty then, but now they do, and that's why we come.
They should have turned you on the street and let them have
what they done
street
tonight ain't gonna bring them back.
My opinion about it, I think it should have been done a long time ago.
A much smaller crowd gathered outside the governor's mansion for a candlelight vigil against the death penalty.
We assume somehow that if we just punish someone else, if we kill someone else, that makes up for the first killing. It doesn't, it just produces another dead body.
But no last-minute stays came through, and Pee Wee Gaskins was strapped into the electric chair.
I was a witness to the execution. And I'll have to say that Pee Wee, if he was scared, he never exhibited it. He didn't show any sign of fear. He walked in on his own because the chair was so big and Pee Wee was a small fellow. He had to crawl up into the chair. And of course they strapped him in and asked him if he had any last words, and he just clenched his fists and said, "Let's go."
After his execution, writer Wilton Earl kept his promise to Gaskins and published the autobiography. In it, Gaskins claimed he would come clean about all of his crimes with this final truth. He gave detailed descriptions of the 14 murders he'd been accused and convicted of, but he also gave shocking accounts of scores of other murders. He categorized his killings as two kinds: those he had been apprehended for in 1975 that he referred to as serious murders, and lust murders, which he referred to as coastal kills that were primarily hitchhikers and runaways that he'd abducted, raped, tortured, and murdered. In the book, his total number of victims was not 14 or 30 as he previously estimated, but 110.
I think it's logical to assume that graves of more of Gaskins' prey are out there waiting to be found.
If that were so, where were the bodies? Where were the missing persons reports of so many vanishing along the countryside?
Pee Wee saw himself as a serial killer, referred in his Final Truth book to a number of cases where he would pick up girls that were hitchhiking. And unhappily in the 70s, girls hitchhiked. It was a difficult time in American history. There was like a sexual revolution going on, a lot of girls kind of taking off on their own, doing crazy things like hitchhiking. Did he kill girls under those circumstances? It's possible.
He either shot you when you weren't looking, or he had some big fellow willing to hold you while he did something to you. It's called The Final Truth. The only truth in that book, there may have been 10% truth in it. The rest of it is all Pee Wee. Just trying to make Pee Wee a big name.
One thing became clear from Gaskins' book: the victims were more numerous than ever suspected. They included the victims' families, Gaskins' family, his friends, and neighbors.
I don't know about the other people. I'm not really ashamed of the association I had with him.
He was always polite to me, and a lot of people he was polite and nice to, and I don't know why. He just had a mental problem, I reckon.
It surprised me that we had a person working here that was that close to us and the employees here, including the secretaries, that would be capable of murdering people.
Well, my dad wouldn't talk much about it. My dad was scared of him for some reason. I guess he knew more than what we did. We got teased a lot, Watch out for them, we weren't like that. But his son was the biggest victim. He just got teased and taunted, and You know, nobody wanted to have much to do with him and stuff like that. But I mean, he was a really good kid.
This is Daddy's words. Without the tapes, I would know this was my daddy. Knowing my daddy like I did over the years, nothing didn't surprise me.
I think this was sort of his feeling of creating his own legacy. And he did, at the expense of his family.
They call him a serial killer. I don't think that was what Pee Wee Gaskins was. I just think he killed people because he didn't like what they did.
Pee Wee Gaskins represents everything that is wrong and evil with this world. You know, I just urge and encourage people to be the best person that you can be and follow the golden rule. If everybody would do that, we wouldn't have any Pee Wee Gaskins.